if you were going to debut 13 ideas in one day, although the Hamilton Project loves all 13 ideas almost equally, wouldn't you say the ones that were a little dearer to your heart for numbers 9, 10, 11, that's you, Tyler, 12, and 13. And so this panel is supposed to talk about alternative or new sources of revenue. And I don't want to take time from the author, so I'm going to just very quickly make 3 observations. I think even after the end of the year deal, the United States government is not on track to generate revenues that approach the expected levels of spending. You can see that when we're back at full employment. You can see that out many years, more than a decade. It's probably also true that marginal tax rates seem frozen for, I think, an extended period of time as part of that deal. And we just heard about tax expenditures and what might be feasible there. And there were a lot of excellent ideas on that panel. I would have voted for your idea, Diane. But they all seemed a little politically challenging. And so what we were going to try to do in this panel with this fabulous set of authors is say, hey, maybe there are new and alternative sources of revenue. And to start that off, I was going to turn to Tyler Duvall, who's an associate principal of McKinsey and Company, and was a former acting undersecretary at the Department of Transportation. And Tyler's going to talk a little bit about user fees and some other ideas in transportation. But I'm just going to start by asking if Tyler can provide a little context for. I thought we paid for all of our infrastructure out of the gas tax. Tyler, what happened to that?
You're right. Forget it.
Yeah. And also, I think it's every month the Society of American Civil Engineers gives us grades on our infrastructure, and they seem to somehow we've hit F, but it keeps going lower. And maybe you could help us explain how your approach is going to solve both of those problems.
Yeah. So the I don't know if people can hear me, but basically the gas tax at the federal level is the predominant mechanism on cars, and diesel tax on trucks. That mechanism for many years was bringing in more revenues than we outlaid, and we had a huge surplus account in the Federal Highway Trust Fund, which funds about 40% of the highway investments and about 40 to 50% of the transit capital investments in the U.S. There was a deal cut by the Congress basically to spend down that balance. The President and the Congress agreed we had a big balance, let's spend it down. Unfortunately, when they did that, they didn't propose any alternative long term. So we're now stuck with a situation where the projected outlays far exceed revenues coming into the trust fund at the federal level. At the state and local level, you've already seen basically a big move away from the gas tax. In fact, the gas tax is a deeply minority tax to fund transportation infrastructure in the U.S., even though everyone at the federal level here in Washington thinks it's the only tax in town. So what we've talked about in many policy circles around the country for many years now is a shift towards a direct user pay system, which frankly was envisioned by William Vickery in the mid-1950s, so this is not a new idea. This is an idea that's been around for many years and now is being implemented around the world and starting to be implemented here in the United States. And it basically uses technology to charge drivers the true cost of driving on roads during peak periods, during off-peak periods, to charge trucks the true prices. And the basic problem is that the prices today have do not bear any relationship to the cost being imposed. So some rough math, we're looking at about a 2 to 3 cent charge per mile to get on the Capitol Beltway here in Washington, D.C., with the true cost being imposed of about 35 to 40 cents a mile. Obviously, at Econ 101, we're going to have a problem with that equation, and we do. So what's great about this idea is it basically is one of the few win-win revenue policy ideas out there in which you see basically better performance outcomes from the system. You see more revenue come in. You see speeds, reliability, and flow conditions improve. You see environmental conditions improve. So from our perspective, what Jack and my perspective is that the country needs to start to transition to this approach more aggressively.
Now, buried in your proposal, there's something you're going to put a GPS on my car, and the government's going to know where I am all the time. Was that your idea?
No, it's definitely not my idea.
Okay.
No, there are clearly lots of different technology solutions. The great thing about where we are as a technological matter is that there are probably 50 different ways you could design a technology to do this. Obviously, the Germans, for instance, are tolling every truck on the Autobahn today using a GPS transponder. They generate about $5 billion a year in revenues for reinvestment in various asset classes in transportation. But for those of you who've lived in the Washington, D.C. area, they just opened up the first high-speed private toll road in the DC area along the Capitol Beltway. That's just an overhead gantry. You buy your Easy Pass from the state of Virginia or frankly any state in the system. You blow through the thing at 65 miles an hour. The only record they keep is when you did it, send you a bill if you obviously go through it without the transponder. So the technology is not an issue. To the extent we want to move towards more futuristic technologies like a GPS-based system, as you said, there are obviously major privacy concerns, many groups concerned about that. I think the reality is if the country as a policy matter was willing and able to do that, you could design privacy protections into those systems.
And would we stop getting Fs from the American society, or is that just a thing because they want to build more bridges?
Yeah, right. So I think actually, the civil engineers obviously put out a rating, I think every 2 years around the quality of the nation's infrastructure. The reality is what's really suffered in the last 15 to 20 years is the performance, so the operating conditions. The physical quality actually of the bridges and the pavement is, believe it or not, better today than it was 15 years ago. I know that doesn't sound to be true, but what's happened is we have a serious decline in the operating performance. Now that doesn't mean the quality is where it should be. Obviously we need to recapitalize, and the great thing about this idea of pricing directly is that it's not just a demand side policy, it's also a supply side policy. So the reason we have bridges to nowhere, the reason why we have this misallocation of resources is because the price signals being sent to this on the supply side don't bear any relationship to balancing supply and demand. So I think you'd see a big...
I think that's a very important part of the proposal. Can you say that in English again?
Yeah, so...
So what's going to happen?
So right now the mechanisms to make
There's a lot of highway miles in West Virginia and Montana, right?
Yes, exactly. We have a lot. We have the largest highway system in the world by double any other country. So the reality is right now the signals sent to suppliers are unfortunately too driven by political forces. So we're not using cost benefit to a large extent. There are only a handful of states that use it systematically to allocate investment dollars. So the reality is we got this huge pool of capital going into the system every year and generating declining returns on investment. And the price signal that we're talking about would not only balance supply and demand, it would also send a signal where the scarcity is most obvious in the system. Today, we use congestion, delays, or other, obviously, political forces to come up with that answer. And I think it would be a clear guide, as we see with railroads, with the electricity grid, all of the network utilities use price signals to allocate resources, and we just don't have that on the highway side.
Thanks. So next we have Ben Harris, who wrote a paper with Bill Gale on the value-added tax. And so I hesitate to do this, but I can't resist the temptation just for a little personal history. So I was an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. Now, at the University of Chicago, Milton Friedman, he's not a deity, but he's a semi-deity. And the reason relates to your proposal, actually, that he's not a full-fledged deity. They still hold him responsible for the payroll withholding tax, which was originally his idea. And the reason is that it's like a money machine for government. So are you proposing that there be another money machine for government?
So let me just first give you the 30-second overview of a value-added tax. A value-added tax is a tax on consumption. It's levied incrementally along the production chain, which sounds like it doesn't matter, but it actually matters quite a bit for the administration of the tax. It's taxed in every OECD country except for the United States. It raises about 20% of revenue in the OECD, so it's a major part of taxation, every major industrialized country in the world. But Michael, to your point, so the VAT has wrecked a lot of careers. In Canada, the Prime Minister proposed it in 1991. He was out several years later. The same thing happened in Japan. There's a sort of warning to congressmen who support the VAT in the late 70s. The chairman of the Ways and Means Committee proposed the VAT, and he lost the next election. Byron Dorgan famously said, the last person who proposed the VAT in Congress doesn't work here anymore. So the VAT has wrecked a lot of careers. Fortunately, Milton Friedman's was not wrecked by the payroll tax. The question about the money machine, a lot of people oppose the VAT on the grounds that it's a money machine, and it's not always clear what they mean. I interpret this one of two ways. One, it could mean that the VAT raises revenue, in which case, yes, you're exactly right. That's what it's designed to do. I mean, the number's up there. That's exactly what this tax, which most taxes are designed to do, to raise revenue. I cannot quarrel with that. Guilty. The second thing people mean about a money machine is that the VAT can lead to larger government. And the fear is, particularly among conservatives, is that if you institute a VAT, that will lead to more spending on the other side of the ledger. And that's a fair concern, particularly for those of us who are concerned about deficits. If we go back and look at the historical experience for all these OECD countries that have instituted a VAT, The IMF has done good research on this, and they found that no, the VAT does not lead to more spending, but more fundamentally, this is a value-added tax for deficit reduction. It's not a value-added tax for more entitlements. It's not a value-added tax for more discretionary spending. It's not even a value-added tax to help deal with the sequester. This is a value-added tax for deficit reduction. One of the pillars of our proposal asks that Congress couple the value-added tax with spending restraint. So it's really a two-part proposal. So I don't think it would be a money machine in the second way that people refer to it.
And can you contrast it with alternative sources of raising revenue? What's so good about tax and consumption? Aren't prices high enough?
I teach a few policy classes at policy schools, and I always talk about the value-added tax and how great it is. And I start off by talking about problems with deficits, and then go and talk about the administrative benefits of a value-added tax. And usually the students are on my side, and then I sort of hit them with, this is just a rise in prices. Bill and I are proposing a 5% increase in prices on everything. And that's how the optimal consumption tax should work. It shouldn't distort your decisions about what you choose to buy. You shouldn't choose to buy a Halloween costume because it's taxed as entertainment, but not, to not buy clothes because it's clothing and it's given a discount over favor of a Halloween costume. You want the decision to be neutral off different types of goods. So the value-added tax is an increase in prices, undoubtedly. We propose a 5% value-added tax, which would raise prices by 5%. This would be the lowest in the OECD, tied with Japan and Canada. And the reason why it's such a favorable way of raising revenue is that it taxes consumption and not saving. So for the economists in the room, you know that income is divided between consumption and saving. And one thing that the value-added tax does that the income tax does not is provide neutrality with respect to decisions about saving and consumption. If you're a saver, you'll be penalized under the income tax, but you won't be penalized under consumption tax like the VAT, and that's the primary advantage over income taxation.
And I think we'd be remiss to move on without talking a little bit about the distributional concerns that people have about value-added taxes.
So one of the primary critiques, other than the money machine argument, about a value-added tax is that it's regressive. That means that it's a higher burden on lower-income households. Pretty much everyone involved in tax policy agrees that progressivity should be one of our primary goals of any tax system. So when I stand up here and I propose something like a value-added tax, people reasonably make the point that it falls higher on lower-income households. Why? Because lower-income households don't have the opportunity to save very much. They tend to consume most of their income. A higher-income household that does save is not going to be taxed as much under a value-added tax. My response to that is twofold. One, it is regressive, but it's not as regressive as you might think. It's mostly a proportional tax to the first 95% of the income distribution or so. The benefit comes for the top 5%. This is not the optimal way to tax anything, to give people the top the best. So what we propose is to help deal with this regressivity concern with a demogrant, which is a $450 cash transfer to everyone for adults and $200 transfers for each child. This would effectively exempt the first $26,000 of consumption. If you spend $26,000, your net tax burden will be exactly zero.
Thank you. On the last panel, I thought Diane made a really good point when we were talking about raising revenue. That there's all these different suggestions on the previous panel, and then we compare them to this panel. That no one really likes more revenue by itself, but you have to think about, well, what would it be instead? And so I think Adele was going to talk a little bit about her ideas on a carbon tax. And I noted in your paper, you said that it's arguably the most efficient form of revenue raising. So you must have in mind it's better than something.
Yes, and I'm so glad, Michael, to have this opportunity to sit on the more politically feasible panel to talk about a carbon tax. So you do want to compare a carbon tax to alternative ways to raise revenue. And we use a couple different dimensions. There's efficiency and equity, which we've heard about. On efficiency ground, a carbon tax stacks up very favorably. And here's why. as we've heard, income taxes reduce the net returns to working and saving and investing and these productive economic activities. For example, by putting that wedge between what an employer pays and what a worker gets to keep, right? And that creates incentives that create genuine economic burden of raising that dollar of government revenue. A carbon tax, on the other hand, shrinks a wedge. Now, what wedge is that? That's the difference between what I pay for fossil fuels, like when I put gasoline in my car, it includes the private cost to produce and market that fuel and a little bit to fund road maintenance, but it doesn't include the environmental damages that come from the combustion gases of that fuel, right? So by internalizing those external costs, I'm actually providing more efficient incentives in the energy markets, and thereby creating more efficient incentives across a whole host of activities. That's which fuels you use in electricity, fuel economy, energy efficiency, deployment of renewables, and very important over long periods of time, the development of new technologies, because the price on carbon is going to give a market to lower emissions technologies, so you don't have to have an inefficient hodgepodge of subsidies for those other technologies.
So one thing I noticed about your proposal, it covers a lot of space, and somehow you snuck in there a discussion of regulations.
Yeah.
So I didn't quite see how what that had to do with carbon taxes.
So, so this package is, I very carefully structured it to illustrate the kind of deal I think can be made, right? So I've got a carbon tax, but it's in the context of a pro-growth tax reform.
So this is like a spoiler alert. This is the politically feasible version?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, really, we've heard this a number of times. Anything in isolation can be picked off as, oh, that'll never happen. But really, compared to the alternative and put it in a context where there's something for everybody, okay? So in my proposal, I've got a pro-growth tax reform where I'm adding a carbon tax, creating efficiency in that market, and I'm using most of that revenue for a permanent reduction in the corporate income tax rate from 35% to 28%. I've got 15% of the revenue reserved to protect the poor, and that's the equity side that which I failed to mention earlier. And I'm also combining that with the suspension of the Clean Air Act authority over greenhouse gases. So I'm eliminating that regulatory uncertainty that's clouding investment in the energy sector. And then if you're worried about trade, I got a careful collection of policies to address any competitiveness issues, including a carefully tailored border carbon adjustment to protect our industries who are energy intensive and trade exposed, and a diplomatic initiative to make sure that our policy is not unilateral. And in addition, we have that corporate income tax reform that's going to make the American economy more competitive across the entire corporate sector.
Thank you. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and we're going to come back in a couple minutes. So next we have Pia Orrenius. So now Pia, when I was going through the list here, I had to remind myself, this is about the budget, and you're writing about immigration. Is there a connection?
Luckily, we were able to come up with something, Michael. So in our plan, we confront, you might ask, well, you're sort of, we don't confront the entire immigration policy or immigration system, but we sort of carve away at the temporary employment-based visas, which you might say, well, why are you dealing with that small sort of subcategory of immigration policy? But actually, if you're looking at what impacts economic growth and productivity, the competitiveness of U.S. firms, I think that would be one of the first places to start with regard to immigration policy. Namely, over the last 15 years, let's say, about a third of the growth in the high-skilled labor force has been through the inflows of high-skilled foreign workers, so it's a very important system. And more over time, those workers have been coming in under temporary employment-based visas like H-1Bs and not under, the green card program. So why do we think that there is room for reform in this particular program? Well, we basically, what we start with is we think that the program would benefit from more market forces. So our idea is to create a market more of a market for foreign workers. And the way we would do this is we would introduce auctions where we would auction off permits to employers to hire foreign workers. And we would have auctions for high-skilled workers, which would accommodate the H-1B type workers, which are computer programmers and doctors and that type of thing. And then we'd have another auction for low-skilled workers, which would accommodate farm workers and other workers coming in under the H-2A program or the H-2B program, which are seasonal programs. The benefit would be that these permits would be tradable, so we would say to employers, you can come and bid for a permit, you can then hire your worker, but then if you change your mind or that worker leaves you, you can sell your permit to another employer. The important change here also is that these visas for workers that would be brought in under this program would be completely portable between employers that have permits that they've gotten either from the auction or from other employers which have sold them the permits. There's a lot of benefits, obviously, aside from generating more revenue. Basically, this creates a market in the sense that it takes the best and the brightest among this foreign workers and funnels them to the employers that value them the most. This is be a natural outcome of the auction. So it's an important change from the system we have now, which is basically first come, first serve. And so it really doesn't take advantage of the fact that when you have more supply, more people willing to come, that you can actually pick the best and not simply the one that's first in line. So we get a more flexible system as well, which will then be more efficient and more selective, which will, the third thing we thought about too, it'll be more transparent, but that may very well doom it, of course. Sometimes I wonder, the reason that we have the system we have is because non-transparency actually, helps it survive. But that's basically our idea in a nutshell.
Can I ask one follow-up question? Now, there's a lot of talk right now about immigration and an immigration bill. Could this fit into a larger immigration bill?
Oh, absolutely. I think it fits in very naturally. The way we are talking about it now is not even to increase the number of employment-based visas, but just to take the existing programs and funnel them into this auction system, which has so many benefits, except for immigration lawyers, of course. But aside from the immigration lawyers, everyone else benefits the way we see it. So we're not even advocating for controversial things like increasing H-1B visas or increasing H-2A visas, but rather just accommodating what's going on now in a more efficient and flexible system.
Thank you. Next we have Phil Swagel. So Phil, I was trying to think of a way to introduce your proposal, and so it struck me there are at least two views about the housing market. The first is that the federal government has got to get out of the way, and the whole problem is the federal government is involved. And then a second view is that there's nothing more important or central to identity in America than the ability to own a home. And so the federal government's got to be right in the center of those two. And I think what you've done is you've found some space in between those two views. So is that going to make everyone hate you, or
Yeah.
how's that going to work?
No, I think that's a good way of doing it. That instead of trying to balance both sides, that housing is important and there's a government role for it, but we don't want taxpayers at risk from too much of a government involvement in the economy and in housing. So, okay, so in some sense, I look at the problem with the housing finance system. The government is dominating it, and private capital is not active in allocating capital. So that's one problem. Another problem, and this is where the panel comes in, is there's about $20 billion with a B of profits every year being generated by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two firms under government control. And in some sense, there's a paradox that those funds haven't been noticed and spent, right? I mean, this is kind of old-fashioned, but when I was in the government, the administration would do an annual budget, and they'd explain, well, here's the revenue and here's the spending. Now, we don't do that anymore, I guess. But one could imagine if there were an annual budget from the administration, that could say, look, here's $20 billion in revenue, and we want to use it for this and this and this. And so you might worry that we're going to build high-speed rail and things that might not be super effective. Which is why I like Tyler's proposal, because it seems much more effective.
I think it might be worth noting that both Phil and Tyler worked in the Bush administration.
Yeah, so he's just more polite. So this is what I like to do is get the government to back away from allocating capital. Have the private sector come in, allocate capital. It'll better protect taxpayers, but I think importantly also, it'll open up access to mortgage financing. Now, right now, essentially we have basically an unelected official, not even a political appointee, deciding basically who gets a mortgage. I think Ed DeMarco's done a great job, but that's not the role. He doesn't want that role. If we have private capital come in and decide which potential home buyers to take risks on, I think is better for everyone. And if there's some provider of private capital who wants to take a risk and puts up their own capital, then that should be, we should find a way in the housing finance system to let that take place. So that's really it, try to balance stability from the government role against the better incentives from private capital and the better access, I would say, from having private capital make the decisions on housing.
And so where does the $130 billion come from?
So the $130 billion is the potential revenue for the government from selling off Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. There's a huge number of issues, but the paper goes through a calculation, a very simplified calculation of what the cash flows in and how that translates into the $130 billion odd revenue for the government. And one point I make is that sometimes there's a tension between maximizing the government revenue and good housing policy, right? That sometimes the government, you might say, well, the government should just be a monopolist, right? And we know monopolists make good profits. That's probably not what we want for housing policy, because we want competition in housing origination. And we want lenders to be competing with each other to make loans to people. And so we see the effects now where originators have backed out of housing and some borrowers face very high interest rates who don't have access. So that's one of the tensions that I explore in the paper, is between revenue and the market structure.
Thanks. So I thought we'd play a little game for the next part of this. And one thing I love about each of these proposals is that the government really is going to need more revenue, I think, going forward. And we have to be serious about finding new ways for that revenue. But I wanted to hear who was willing to make the case that theirs, among all these worthy ideas, was the most politically feasible.
I could. I mean, in some sense, I think housing finance is one of these issues where both sides are in the way, right? The housing finance system works for many people, and so from the administration's point of view, well, look, it works, don't fix it. It's not broken. Of course, we all know that many people don't have access to housing finance. On the other hand, if you read my paper, you'll see that I'm proposing a new government backstop, right? This is yet another bailout. Now, I would say let's formalize the government role in order to shrink it, but obviously from the right, the idea of formalizing a government role is not attractive. So it's really both sides, I think, are in the way.
And I should add, if you think someone else's proposal is more feasible, you can advocate for that one.
Well, I want to make one case for a carbon tax, and that is, when people express concern about the political feasibility of the carbon tax, it's the implicit assumption is that the alternative is no climate policy. Well, that's not the alternative. The default is the regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, which was never designed for the kind of pollutant that we have with greenhouse gases. And that's going to be a protracted, messy, long promulgation of regulations and state implementation plans and litigation, and it'll be 10 years before we actually see something take effect. And all that time, we've got investment uncertainty and really a dangerous delay in serious action on climate policy. So I think if you're even if you don't even care about the climate, you don't even think it's a problem, you've got the Supreme Court supporting the president's authority to regulate under the Clean Air Act, and he says he's going to do it. So that's a very credible threat. So get your market-based environmental policy while you can, and do it in the context of fiscal reform where you can have a pro-growth tax reform at the same time.
That was passionate.
Let me just add that that is perfectly politically feasible. And how do I know? Because it's been done 150 times before in other countries. The only countries that don't have VATs are a few countries in the Middle East and a few island nations. Everyone else has seen the benefits of the VAT and put it in place. And that's not a reason to have a VAT. It's okay to be different. The reason to have a VAT is because we need revenue. We're in a fiscal crisis, and from where I sit, there are really only three options for getting out of this fiscal mess if you think that revenues need to be part of the solution. One is a VAT, another is a carbon tax, another is the one that what Diane proposed when she was standing here before is limiting tax expenditures in some broad way. Beyond that, these are they're good ideas, but they don't really get to the magnitude of the problem with our fiscal shortcomings. So is it politically feasible? I think so. We've done it before. We've seen it happen in other countries, and it's one of the only solutions to the fiscal mess we've gotten ourselves into.
So you're giving up on American exceptionalism? Pia, do you want to take a stab?
I can give lots of examples of why the current system is wrong. I guess I don't know if that's going to convince the lawmakers or not. But for example, we had a joint conference with the Bush Institute at the Dallas Fed in December, and there was a woman from Oracle there, and she was saying just how many unfilled vacancies they have at Oracle every month. It was something like 3,000 positions go unfilled month after month because of the lack of H-1B visas. Which obviously, there's not enough to go around. And then she also said that even when they're allocated, even when they put in for H-1B visas and say they put in for 5, and they maybe just get 1 or 2 approved of those, then they don't get to pick, of the 5 workers they wanted to sponsor, they don't get to pick the best ones, the ones they truly, they most wanted out of those 5. But just whoever the government decided to process first is the one that they get. And it's just, what a terrible outcome, and how easy to fix.
Now, do you think there's any lawyers who are able to get their clients in the front of the line?
I suspect so. If you look at what they charge. But yeah, so we have to sock it to the, no. But there's definitely lots of middlemen in this area, and so I think one benefit of a more transparent system that we're proposing these auctions, I just think one really good outcome is that you eliminate a lot of middlemen.
Can I put a plug in for mine?
Yeah, please.
So mine is the only one that's actually already happening. So we've got, in the last 5 years, 6 states in the United States have opened up these facilities. And so the real question is, can we go faster and more comprehensive? And can the federal government basically drive that more aggressively than it is? And and the other thing we've got, in addition to successful experiments with the technology, is we got really popular experiments. So the public opinion polling on all of the experiments that have been done to date are 75 to 90% public support. Now, before you do this, it's very hard to explain what it is because people can't experience it. And the Swedes did one of the more fascinating public policy experiments of all time when they basically, around Stockholm, drew a cordon effectively to charge people to go into downtown Stockholm, and they basically said, all right, let's do it. We literally cleared up the congestion overnight in Stockholm. We're going to do it for 7 months. We're going to take it down. We're going to let you experience life as it was before, and then we're going to have you vote on what you want. The public support at the time they rolled it out was 10%. The time they voted on it, 61%, and they kept it. And they threw out the government that put it in at the same time.
And so now, you said it started to spread up in the U.S. Has it affected? Is that just on existing roads, or has it affected the placement of infrastructure?
Yeah. So one of the big,
I think it seems to me a big part of the
the big political challenge is touching existing facilities. So the experiments to date have been squeezing out capacity in existing corridors, shifting HOV lanes. So on I-95 in Miami, for instance, they restriped it, the most congested stretch of I-95. If you've been down there, you can now go free flow for about 20 miles on that road, when before you were literally dead stop. Now, they took existing capacity only to the extent it was an HOV lane. The first ever, though, conversion of an unpriced road took place in Seattle about 1.5 years ago, the 520 bridge, which basically connects Microsoft's headquarters to downtown Seattle. And Microsoft was a big proponent of this, basically converted. And now you can go free flow from Redmond to downtown Seattle every day. And what's great about these experiments is they are being sold to the public correctly as performance experiments, not simply revenue generators.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. One thing I just wanted to return to Adele's proposal. Now, the thing is, it is global climate change. And so one criticism people often have of these kinds of policies are that, if we just do something, but if China and India don't do anything, who cares? we're still going to have climate change. And one of my favorite climate change facts, they have now had to introduce new colors on the weather map in Australia after this summer, because to get to the high level. But so my question is this really going to help with global climate change, and why might it or why wouldn't it?
Well, certainly as the largest historical emitter, the U.S. has a responsibility here. Even though we're not currently the largest single emitter, we happen to still be the second largest single emitter. And really, everybody's eyes are on the United States. It is a necessary condition for countries around the world to take serious action on climate change that could eventually lead to the stabilization of these gases in the atmosphere. It's not a sufficient condition. So, my proposal includes a vigorous diplomatic aspect. We need to leverage our action into action by other countries. I've got a separate paper where I elaborate how we could instigate a carbon pricing dialogue with other countries to try to encourage action that's analogous to ours and mutually ramp up our ambition over time in a way that really will lead to global containment of this serious risk. But you're absolutely right. The U.S. can't do it by ourselves, but look, if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it.
Okay, do any of you have questions for each other, or happy to open the discussion to the floor?
Okay.
I have a question for Adele.
Sure.
So being in Texas, so I hear a lot about energy, although I'm not an energy economist. The premise of the question is not all carbon is created equal, I guess. So why am I saying that? Well, I'm alluding to, for example, now that the oil prices are so high and natural gas prices are so low, natural gas rigs are being shut down and drilling is going down in terms of natural gas production, and oil production is rising. And the interesting thing is when I saw, these carbon emissions were the lowest I think they've been in 20 years, looking at the first quarter data, or the data that just came out for last year. And the explanation that was given was that this is really because natural gas is so cheap and it's used in electricity production, so now, and less coal is used. So natural gas has actually contributed to declining carbon emissions. So would you comment?
Sure. The good news is that actually carbon is all created equal. So if you price carbon, you're going to give everyone the incentive to switch from coal to natural gas, because more of the BTUs of natural gas come from hydrogen than in coal, right? So what you're doing is creating all the right incentives across all of the potential energy sources to back out of the most polluting ones and move into the less polluting ones, just according to their cost effectiveness at reducing those emissions. Now, what you point out is a great lesson for us. That's demand slopes downward, right? So when natural gas became cheaper, we started using more of it. That means that when carbon becomes more expensive, we're going to emit less of it. And we've seen that time and again across the energy economy. Prices matter. And they particularly matter over long periods of time, because one of the drivers of the new technologies that have brought natural gas prices down were high natural gas prices, right? So that tells us that when carbon's more expensive, those technologies that reduce carbon are going to become a lot more attractive to investors and consumers. And that's exactly what we want for the cost-effective addressing of this environmental problem.
Phil, did you have a question?
No. That's not.
I just want to come back to your proposal before we open the floor.
Yeah.
So you think with the reform you're suggesting, it's going to increase access to the housing market for people? Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a good question. There's going to be two effects. So one is having more private capital will likely raise mortgage interest rates, right? That's the consequence of protecting taxpayers is to raise mortgage interest rates. So that will reduce access in a sense. But right now, there's a hard cutoff. There's some people who just cannot get a mortgage. The channels by which private investors can take risks on certain borrowers are just cut off. And that's what I would open up by having both a government-backed mortgage sector and then one in which there's no government role. And some just have those side by side, the so-called private label securitization. And in that channel, private investors could take risks And that would increase the access for mortgage financing.
Okay, I think we should open the floor to questions. There's a question there in the back.
Hi, my name's Yuande Alade, and I'm a recent graduate from Swarthmore College, but I currently work in DC. And my question is directed towards Benjamin Harris, and it's about the VAT. And even though you said that across the board VAT shouldn't change anything on the consumer side in terms of saving and purchasing, some people have expressed a concern that it may cause undual burden in terms of compliance and production. So I was hoping you could speak to that.
That's an excellent question. In the last panel, someone also stood up and asked, what about state and local governments? These are kind of related, and let me explain how. 45 out of 50 states plus 9,000 local governments currently use a retail sales tax. And the tax system is a mess. Raises revenue, but it's a mess. States have to comply with different tax bases, different tax rates. There's a fair amount of evasion. And most importantly, one of the worst things about it is that there are business-to-business taxes, which shouldn't happen. So when a business purchases an input from another business, it shouldn't be taxed in the retail sales tax, but it is. In fact, about 40% of the retail sales tax revenue comes from business-to-business transactions. And this is not, I mean, it sounds like it's this sort of like esoteric concern. It's not. It raises the cost of business investment, it raises the cost of doing business, and it makes businesses less competitive. So your question about compliance and administration, I see the VAT as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to harmonize all of these various state and local taxes into a single unified value-added tax. And this is an enormous task. States don't want to do this, but it might be good for them. In Canada, when Canada went ahead and put the value-added tax in place in 1991, over several years, it gave states the opportunity to harmonize under the existing value-added tax. And not states, provinces, and many provinces did. Some did, some didn't. And for those that did, it ended up being a pretty good experience. It wasn't without its growing pains, but basically what happened was that these provinces that chose to harmonize went ahead and had the exact same tax base as the federal system. The federal government collected taxes on behalf of the provinces, allowed them to choose their own rates in a way that would suit their own needs, and then distributed it back to them. So this is a real opportunity to take away not just the administrative burden from states, but also the compliance burden for American businesses that are forced to comply with this incredibly complex web of retail sales taxes.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Hi, I'm David Vandenberg from Tax Analyst. This question is for Adele. Can you talk about how the case for a carbon tax is different, stronger, or weaker on tax policy grounds versus energy policy grounds?
You know, one of the great things about a carbon tax is that it is a twofer. You get more efficient tax policy, and you get more efficient environment and energy policy. And really, you know, there's no shortage of distortionary tax instruments, and there's no shortage of inefficient environment policies. What we have right now is the prospect, like I said, of Clean Air Act regulation. We also have, you know, assorted dogs and cats of various subsidies and tax credits and loan guarantees and grants and federal procurement of this and that on the environmental side. And frankly, economically, it's not very rational. So as a way to promote clean energy. So the chances here are to kind of rationalize both sides of the coin and have an efficient revenue instrument that also allows you a more efficient way to address your environmental goals.
I would just add the same thing. As Adele and I were colleagues at the Treasury and worked on these issues together before she moved to Brookings. In some sense, I think the policy will go forward when it can be sold on both sides. Like this side says, okay, we're saving the planet, and this side says we're lowering taxes and boosting growth, and somehow we need that double-sided paper.
That's
right.
Here's a
Barrett Walker with the Walker Foundation. I just read that China has proposed a carbon tax. Will that change anything in this country?
Isn't there the famous quote, that I don't remember any Chinese official having a vote in the U.S. Senate.
You know, I'm glad you asked that question because one of the continual arguments we've heard against serious climate policy in the United States is the lack of analogous policy in our major trading partners and major developing economies in particular. So I strongly believe the U.S. should say, all right, you want to talk about a carbon tax? Let's discuss. And you know, we're in the middle of a very important fiscal discussion. You guys have your own issues with air pollution and things you need to deal with on the revenue side. Let's have a multilateral conversation about how we can all move together. And I would love to see the U.S. welcome the signals by the Chinese that they are interested in pricing carbon. And I've been frankly disappointed that we haven't heard more from the United States and other parties to the Major Economies Forum welcoming those kinds of statements and saying, let's get together and let's talk about this, because there are more and more countries now that are pricing carbon at the federal level and at the sub-federal level. And I strongly believe that's an opportunity for us to get together, discuss this issue, and move forward together. Because it does, as you said, Michael, it is a global effort, and it is important that we all move together. And as we've said, we need that moving together for our own domestic reasons, to give people comfort that we're not unilaterally disarming our economy.
There's a question right here.
Hi, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay. Nancy Spenis with Executive Intelligence Review. I'd like to go back to the big picture for a minute and the crisis that we're dealing with, and here on the fact that we had a financial blowout in 2007, and the crisis is worse now because we're subsidizing massively the very banks that brought that crisis about in the first place. The solution that's been put on the table by many economists, including the former Kansas City Fed head, Thomas Honig, including now Sandy Weil, including my organization, Lyndon LaRouche, including many others, is Glass starts with cutting that obligation, cutting the bailout. It will really help our finances.
You know,
globally.
I think, I remember you asked a question earlier today. I think we had a chance to discuss that. Excellent question.
Only one person answered Glass-Steagall,
yes,
and I would appreciate if they would.
I think given all the other people in the room, it's probably unfair to them to ask the same question twice. So why don't we find a second person we can ask a question to over here.
Hi, I'm Phillip Rolnick with the National Small Business Network. Adele, you've talked about using the money from the tax on the carbons to reduce the corporate tax rate. Most small businesses are pass-through entities, and they pay their taxes at the individual tax rate. Would you be willing to adjust your recommendation to include special tax rates for these individuals who are paying their taxes at their individual rates?
Well, you bring up a good question about the double taxation of capital income. And right now we have capital taxes on the corporate side. We also tax a second time dividends and capital gains on the personal income side. So there could be a case to be made to make some of the adjustments on the corporate income tax rate and some of the adjustments on the capital income side of the personal income tax. And I think that would get at the kind of folks you're talking about. I think there's a good case to be made to making this tax swap on the capital income side, whether you do it just on corporate or you do it on capital income in the personal income tax, because those tend to be the most distortionary taxes, and I think you're getting your most pro-growth tax swap with that capital income tax reduction. But yeah, there could be a variety of formulas one could use of how to exactly you structure that capital income tax reform.
Okay, I think there's a question here, and maybe we'll have time for one more after that.
Mine's very quick. It's for Pia. On these H-1B visas, a lot of them are actually, they are randomly distributed, which I see as a big disadvantage. But a lot of them are distributed to companies in the creative industries that are much lower paid. So one consequence of what you put in place is that all of them will go to people in technology and higher paying fields, and people's like chefs, designers, artists, who now get randomly distributed some, they'll no longer be accessed, and it will sort of change the flavor of some of those industries.
Well, you raise an excellent point, and that's been a criticism of our idea, is that small businesses, nonprofits, and lower-paying industries are the ones that would really come up short in the system. And I think some of that criticism probably rings true in the sense that we expect it was going to bias towards the big-paying firms like Microsoft and so forth, Oracle, high-tech industry and other industries that pay more are going to bring in also more productive workers. And of course, that's we do propose a solution for nonprofits because we say have them bid, because they bring in obviously important STEM workers that work in research and development and so forth. So have them participate in the auction, and then the government can rebate, some of the fee to them, so they're not paying the full price. And I don't know, maybe you could come up with a scheme like that for small business. I don't know. I mean, you could probably divide. The good thing about the auction is it's very flexible. Really, you can change the number of people that you're bringing in, change, what the prices people pay, or firms pay. I mean, it's very flexible and it's transparent. It would really, it can accommodate many different schemes.
Wouldn't you be able to hold separate if people thought that there was not enough of chefs or not enough of NBA players or something? Couldn't you hold separate auctions in each of those categories and meet whatever political objective people had?
I guess. I mean, the level of we also argue that this would be a more simple system. So I think Madeline wants to take this question. She's going like this: cut off Michael's head. Is that what you want to say? No. Oh, bad question.
She's not
bad
alone.
Suggestion. It's a bad suggestion.
Okay, I think we have the final question here.
This question relates to the last question and extends it to the VAT and the carbon tax. The real problem that often seems is with any tax system is the human desire to decide that certain activities are more desirable than other activities. In England, you have a VAT with several thousand different rates depending on what it is you're buying. In the carbon tax, why a carbon tax rather than an energy tax? Because you value carbon emissions more than you value the reduction of energy. And we just heard why you don't want to even discuss having multiple auctions for multiple skill sets. But what really can you do about that in terms of rational tax reform that will stop making unwise choices, since the power to choose is also the power to have unwise choices?
Yeah, let me go directly to that, because this is why I've proposed a carbon tax, because it goes straight to the market failure. What is it that's creating the damage? It's the buildup of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There's no reason from a climate perspective to care whether you use solar or wind or electric cars or what have you.
Nuclear has got its own opponents.
Well, exactly. So my proposal would create an environmentally neutral playing field. Say, if you can reduce carbon, whether it's nuclear or solar, duke it out and let the market decide what the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions is. In my view, the government doesn't need to take a position on it, and in fact shouldn't. You fund basic research, but then let the market determine which of those technologies are going to be most cost effective. That's not a comparative advantage of government, frankly, is determining these winners and losers. Let the market do what it's good at and fix the market failure with the tax.
You've already started with the determination that energy sources that use carbon are not as good as energy sources that don't emit carbon.
Well,
that's a decision, and it might even turn out to be an unwise decision if you had 100 years to argue it out.
It's a well-documented scientific result. It's not my opinion.
This is an economic spin. I think your question is well suited for a scientific panel,
right.
where I think.
It's all economic.
I think that there seems to be a
so
consensus in that bill.
I'm stipulating the science
so
on that.
I think we've probably run out of time at this point.
Can I ask Pierre one real quick question?
Yeah. Tyler's got one question.
In a scenario where the government controls the supply, like in through some regulatory mechanism, is there concern that obviously that supply constraint will produce more revenues that they will then realize, let's actually continue to constrain the supply, even though the market would dictate further? I mean, do we create a perverse incentive on the supply side?
Yeah, I think, right. I mean, I think, but you also have they have a responsibility vis-a-vis employers, I think. And I think we also talk about, you really don't want these permit prices to fluctuate too wildly, because you really want employers to be able to count on, being able to bring in the workers that they are accustomed to or that they need and so forth. So I think the government is going to have the incentive vis-a-vis employers and voters and so forth, not to be, take advantage of that to set prices too high. I had a question for Ben. So VATs, so when I go home to Sweden, when I visit my family in Sweden, they have a VAT. Of course, I think it's 25% on almost everything. I guess one criticism is, or I always thought, was that one nice thing about the sales tax here is that you see it everywhere. So I tell my kids, look, this is the tax you're paying. So the VAT is sort of an invisible tax. How do you?
That's a concern that's often raised. The VAT can be an invisible tax, or it can be a transparent tax. Some countries do print the VAT paid on every receipt. And in fact, in these cases, there's no more transparent tax than having a tax that's literally handed to you every single time you pay it. In our proposal, we said, yes, make it a transparent tax, like some countries do, not like Sweden, if Sweden doesn't. Make it like the countries that tell you every time you pay it. And I'm happy to argue that there is no more transparent tax than a value-added tax properly designed. Good question.
Okay, so I think let's just step back for one moment. Appreciate everyone who's been here through all 13 proposals. I had the idea that everyone should be awarded an ice cream sandwich at the end. I was outvoted on that idea. Karen Anderson will be fielding questions about that at the end of this. So I thought we should close just by highlighting kind of what these 5 authors did, which is kind of amazing. These 5 authors all have policies that are, in principle, if implemented in the way that they've outlined, can contribute to budget consolidation, which is absolutely necessary, and at the same time, increase savings, get rid of carbon, build the right roads, get the right workers here, and allow people who can't get mortgages currently, although they are capable of paying their mortgage, to be able to take out home loans. So I think you can join me in congratulating these authors.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.